I hope that we never cross paths in the author world. But if we do, even though I am physically weaker, he is still in his 60s. So I feel like I could still square up. Before you make fun of me for filming in a car with a bunch of junk in the background, let me explain the context. I am parked in front of a crematorium right now because there has been a death, so I'm currently waiting for their ashes. The reason why there's a bunch of stuff in the background is because I am helping someone move this person's stuff out of the apartment because obviously they can't pay the rent anymore. Basically, 2025 is already pretty crummy. And the thing about death is that it brings so much pain and sorrow and loss. Right now, I just wish for all of those things to be collected and transferred over to Neil Gaiman instead. Last summer, there was a British podcast that broke the news that multiple women were accusing Neil Gaiman of sexual assault. Neil Gaiman is someone that you probably know, even if you have never personally consumed his works like I haven't. He's the author of Coraline and The Sandman. He's very well known among the fantasy, sci-fi community, very much acclaimed, very much someone who is seen as a literary hero. So many of the women that came forward about Neil Gaiman were in their 20s when they were assaulted. Neil Gaiman at the time was in his 40s or older, which means that by that time he already has this reputation of being one of the most renowned comic book writer and fantasy author, and also of self-proclaimed feminist. So he had a very good reputation, and I think that really factored into the abuse as well. What has now become a bigger story is a New York article written by Lila Shapiro. This article essentially talks great detail about the women who have been assaulted and coerced and abused by Neil Gaiman. It connects these stories to his relationship with his wife, Amanda Palmer, who was very complicit, I dare say even enabling these situations in the first place. What is awful about it is that, it's already bad enough that it's happening to one woman, it's happened to 2 women, it's happened to 3 women, but there have been 8 women who have never met each other, who have come forward with all their own individual stories, but they all say the same thing. And so, again, obviously we should believe victims even if there's only one person that comes out. But some people can still be skeptical. Some people are very reluctant with letting go of their favorite author. But when you have 8 women coming forward, this is the nail in the coffin. Some shit ain't right. For this video, I am going to recap the allegations that Neil Gaiman has and why he deserves a prime spot in hell. I do warn you though that it has very triggering content. I'm not gonna go into every single thing, but I'll try my best to be thorough about it for those of you who aren't able to read through the whole thing. And then after I recap the situation, I want to discuss a little bit about this archetype that we seem to see over and over about the sensitive male artist who people just believe is harmless and could do no wrong, and how society seems to often put sensitive men up on a pedestal, especially men who proclaim to be a feminist. I feel like there's some discussion to be had about that. So I'm going to read off of the notes on my phone to recap the situation. Again, a lot of it is very triggering, so if you do not want to hear the details about what happened, feel free to skip ahead. I always have timestamps in my video description. The main person that we are going to be hearing about in the article is Scarlett Pavlovich. She is the central victim in this situation because she has provided the most details around, and her situation is just really terrible because when you hear her background of being homeless, being jobless, being financially insecure, you can understand how the circumstances have led her to being a vulnerable person in this situation. She was hired to take care of Amanda Palmer's child, and like I said before, Amanda Palmer is the ex-wife of Neil Gaiman. Amanda invited Scarlett over to visit Gaiman's house, and so that was how Scarlett met Gaiman for the first time. He invited her to have a bath in his back garden, and she interpreted as just him trying to show her around this very lovely, nice house that these rich people own. So when she goes to the back garden and goes ahead and takes a bath, she was surprised to find Gaiman joining her later naked. He tells her to get comfortable and to sit on his lap, and she explains that she doesn't want to. Also, for context, she is gay. Amanda has told him as such, like she's very openly gay about this, so there's no situation or instance where she would be interested. Unfortunately, even though she said that she didn't want to, he went ahead and coerced her anyway. He penetrated her anus with his finger and attempted to do the same with his penis, and he was very insistent on her calling him master. After he finished, he then tells her that apparently Amanda Palmer had told him that he couldn't have her. Like before they met, she already kind of like warned him, which is kind of weird because it's like, if you were a woman who has to warn your husband or ex-husband about this younger girl who's coming, why would you even invite that girl in the first place? Especially because he literally admits that the fact that she told him that he couldn't have her made him want her even more. And then he was complaining that he wished it was like the old days where he and his wife could have both had sex with her together, because I guess that was what they did back in the day. But now it's just him doing that to people who don't want that shit. After that, Amanda was very pleased that Scarlett was getting along very well with her child, so she offered Scarlett the chance to continue working with her and Gaiman both domestically and on international trips, so they would like invite her to go along with them. There was one night after Scarlett had helped Neil Gaiman and the son with a bunch of household duties. Neil dropped her off, and that was when he assaulted her. Basically, he removed her pants and he beat her with his belt. He also tried to penetrate her anus even though she was screaming, and he backed off, but then he returned with butter to use as lube. He then raped her and demanded that she would clean him afterward, and when she refused to do so, he said that she was defying her master. One time, the anal sex that they had was so painful that she passed out. There was another time where he forced her to give him oral while his penis still had urine on it. He also would put it in her mouth, and he did it so roughly that she had to throw up. Then he demanded that she lick up her vomit. This whole dynamic of him demanding that she call him master and him calling her slave got so bad and pervasive that even a week into her time with her taking care of the house and their son, even his son began to call her a slave and even told her to call him master. So again, that just goes to show that this child is being exposed to this kind of behavior. Another time, when they were sitting together to watch TV, Neil Gaiman was fondling her breasts on the couch right in front of his son. And another time, she was called in to take care of his son at a hotel. And then when Neil Gaiman returned at the hotel, he wanted them to watch a film together. When the son was busy with the iPad, Neil Gaiman would push Scarlett onto the bed and began having sex with her. They would go to the bathroom, he would urinate on his hand and tell her to lick it off. Even though the son was distracted, allegedly on the iPad, the kid was still literally in the same room. He is definitely exposed to this kind of stuff. So it's one of those things where it's like, it's not just abuse for like these women at this point, it's literally child abuse. Okay, so 3 weeks later, Scarlett got COVID, and so Neil Gaiman and Amanda Palmer allowed her to self-isolate in his home. And at that time, she was still not paid for any of the work that she was doing. 10 days later, she told Amanda what happened, like with the bath incident and that they had been having sex afterward, but she kept like the more brutal aspects to herself. But she was also begging first that she would be able to keep her job and living situation, because otherwise she wouldn't have a place to stay in. Amanda replied, "I will take care of you," and that she had dealt with this before. But the only thing that Amanda seems to have done was to just contact Neil Gaiman and ask if their son was wearing headphones at the hotel, and then Neil said no. And then that was it. This is just one of the many examples of how Amanda was very complacent and enabling of his behavior, because there was a marriage counselor that they had seen where she had insisted that Neil Gaiman needed psychiatric help. The counselor put him in touch with a psychiatric facility where he was meant to go there for 6 weeks, but he never did. There was another session where Amanda said that Scarlett was planning to Me Too Neil Gaiman, and his response to that was that he wanted to kill himself. So obviously the lack of accountability of doing anything put Scarlett in a very bad position of being very depressed. She became suicidal. She started overdosing on medication. She then asked Amanda for financial help, but Amanda said that she could not provide that. And then she had to message Neil Gaiman to ask for financial help. So Neil agreed, but first he sent her an NDA to sign. For those of you who don't know, an NDA basically is like a non-disclosure agreement where you agree to not reveal or talk about what happened publicly. Like, you keep it a secret. So after the NDA is signed, he sent her a payment of $1,700 a month later. And then 2 months later, he sent other payments that added up to $9,200. And then 2 years ago in 2023, Amanda filed a police report about Neil Gaiman and his sexual assault to her. When she filed it, she thought that Amanda would cooperate with her because she had seemed to be sympathetic before. However, when the police contacted Amanda, she declined to speak. Neil Gaiman also provided a written statement, but other than that, he and the police never really made any further contact. And the reason why this story has broken out was because Scarlett met with some of the other women who were his victims in Atlanta in December 2024. So literally last month. And they only knew that the other people existed and they were also victims because of the podcast that had come out last summer. They felt like they were survivors of the same cult. And basically because Scarlett was able to meet the other victims, there was a sense of solidarity in feeling like she isn't abandoned anymore and that she's not alone in this. I want to take a chance to talk about some of the other victims though, just so that you see that this wasn't just like a one-off situation. Keep in mind that again, the women who have accused him were mostly in their 20s when he assaulted them. One of them was 18, 2 of them were his employees, 5 of them were his fans. None of these relationships, even if they thought that they had wanted it at the time, could be considered consensual because of the nature of their dynamic. So there's another woman, Brenda. These are all pseudonyms, by the way. Brenda basically said that she had ended up in bed with him after he was awarded at the World Horror Convention. The fact that they even met at a convention already shows like the power imbalance of like this author who's already super famous and then this fan of his that would do anything to please him. At least that's what she thought. And he demanded to be called master again, and she promised him her soul. There is another woman, Catherine Kendall, who was in her 20s when she met Gaiman. They had a flirtationship going on, but she made it clear by explicitly telling him that she didn't want to have sex. However, after he did a reading in a bus together, he was laying on top of her and demanded that she kissed him. One of the reasons that he was demanding that was, quote, he was used to getting what he wants. Then afterward, he paid her $60,000 for her to use on therapy to just make up for it. The 18-year-old who was a victim was Kendra Stout. She met him when she was in line to get a signing from him. He asked her to remain in contact with him, and then after that, he would write these really long emails to her, and then he even bought her a webcam so that they could video chat together. And then 3 years later, he took her on a date. On the date, when he was having his way with her, he told her that he didn't believe in foreplay or lube. So that meant that it was a very painful experience. And then when she said that it was painful, his reply was that she wasn't submissive enough. So it was a total disregard for the pain that she was experiencing. And in fact, it hurt so bad that she got a UTI later when she joined him on a trip to Cornwall, England. The UTI was so painful that she couldn't even walk. So afterwards, she asked him to please not penetrate her. They could do other things and she was okay with that, but just no penetration. That didn't matter because he still inserted his penis and raped her. There's another incident in 2010 where Amanda Palmer had slept with a fan who we will call Rachel. She had also taken nude photos of this fan. So again, very weird boundaries that both these people in this couple have with their fans. Amanda had asked to send one of the nude photos to Neil Gaiman. And then 6 months later, she would introduce that person to Neil Gaiman. Those two would end up in a sexual relationship. And then when Rachel asked Amanda for advice on this, Amanda said that she should find out on her own. Rachel said that Gaiman was constantly pushing her outside of her comfortable boundaries, and she felt like she was often used as a toy that was just being offered to him by Amanda. In 2014, Neil and Amanda moved to upstate New York. Amanda got pregnant and then they started to have a more traditional relationship. However, there was another girl in her 20s who Neil Gaiman took the virginity of and said that he was going crazy for her and he wanted to change his ways, and that was when they started seeing a couples counselor. There's another story by a couple named Caroline and Philip who had both been employed by Gaiman to work on their property, basically helping with the building and maintenance. And in return for their work, they would get a 5-acre plot to live with their daughters. Eventually, Philip moved away, which meant that Caroline was the only employee on the team that was there. And so once it was just her, Neil Gaiman groped Caroline, and then they began a sexual relationship. He would make excuses to call down to her without any warning. One time he found her crying, and during this time, he inserted his thumb in her mouth and grabbed her nipples. And the reason why Caroline went along with it when he was being very handsy with her was because of the fact that he had given her the 5-acre plot with her daughters. And so she was afraid that if she was resistant or said no in any way, then he would kick her and her 3 daughters off the property. So again, the fact that like housing was dependent on this guy does not make a consensual relationship, and it's very easy for him to, you know, push himself onto her. Unfortunately, he did eventually demand that she would leave the property. She had been offered $5,000 to sign an NDA. Fortunately, she knew that it was like a pathetic amount, so she asked for $300,000 instead, to which he accepted. So again, we're establishing a pattern, right? Like all of the women that he has made his moves on and have started these sexual relationships with were women who were in a more subordinate position to him, whether he was like their employer or whether he was like an author and they were a fan because they really admired him. And his solution to everything, anytime like a woman was not treated well, was to just throw money at her because he's a rich author. But throwing money at someone doesn't absolve the trauma that they have to deal with for the rest of their lives. Anyway, he did end up writing a response. Instead of linking to his website, since I don't want him to get any clicks, I'll just put the images here if you want to pause and read it. But I don't think it's even worth reading because a lot of the language that he uses is basically him trying to diminish the situation. He tries to position himself as someone who is learning and trying to do the work, someone who's continuing to grow, but then at the same time, he says that he doesn't accept that there was any abuse, and he is insisting that all of his sexual relationships were completely consensual. Again, I have to insist, there is no way that any of these relationships can be consensual. He was in a position of power. They were fans, they were employees, they had their living situations provided by him, they had finances provided by him. You cannot have a consensual BDSM relationship if the submissive person literally depends on you for income and household. I would argue that this isn't even a BDSM thing. The fact that he literally sought out women who were in vulnerable positions and still kept on going even after they said no or after they expressed discomfort or pain, it shows that it was that very lack of consent that made him turned on. Because think about it, like this is a rich author. He clearly has money to throw away to do anything. They could have hired literally anybody else, and yet they decided to hire this young woman who has had no experience working as a professional nanny. She doesn't have a penny to her name. She doesn't have family who can support her. She doesn't have friends who can support her. It just seems a little bit too convenient that they would pick her out of any other people that they could have had at their disposal. And the fact that his son was involved in this is basically child abuse. That kid is not safe with the dad or the mom. That's basically my recap of it. Let's eat a protein bar and just like digest how horrible people are. Okay, so I'm back home now, and this is the part in the video where now that I have explained basically what the allegations were and the pattern that he's established, I want to just basically give my own 2 cents about a few certain topics that I've noticed whenever something like this happens. The first thing I want to talk about is that throughout the article, a lot of people were describing their impression of Neil Gaiman as someone who seemed to have like a quiet nature about him. He seemed charming and confident and otherwise harmless. And it made me think about this archetype that a lot of men like him seem to have whenever they are beloved by the community for the works that they create, but also the personality that they seem to project onto the public. Because while I was someone who was never like in any of the fandoms that he was in or had consumed his work, I read that apparently part of the popularity that he had on the internet was him interacting with people on Tumblr, him sharing his thoughts about the world and the work that he was creating. There is almost this type of personality of like the sensitive, a little quirky, artsy, messy haired, harmless white guy that is the same age as your dad, that is very appealing to like the early 2010s Tumblr audience demographic. And I feel like it's that type of impression that people have that makes people not realize or not want to believe that these people can be a predator too. Because when we think about predators, I think it's very easy to kind of jump to the stereotype of a skeevy, gross man who wouldn't be capable of writing a story that's perceived to be wholesome or good quality work. So as long as they market themselves as being very kind and inclusive, that's enough to jump them up to the status of being a hero or a role model. One of the tweets I found from him shows him saying, "On a day like today, it's worth saying, I believe survivors. Men must not close our eyes and minds to what happens to women in this world. We must fight alongside them for them to be believed at the ballot box and with art and by listening and and change this world for the better. To which Amanda Palmer replied, "Thank you for this amazing feminist AF husband. All men, all women, all artists, all hands on deck. This is getting serious. We need everyone." At the time that this was tweeted, of course it would be congratulated because he's saying the right things. In retrospect, now that we know what we know, it is full of BS, especially with that added layer of Amanda, who is an enabler for all of the bullshit that's happened, perpetuating this higher pedestal of him being an amazing feminist of a husband. And it doesn't even matter that throughout history, women have been saying the exact same thing. Those things aren't seen at a grander scale in the same way that a tweet by this humble, sensitive, white male artist is doing. And so that makes me wonder, why do we turn to men to be idols or role models? Especially when it comes to industries like film or writing or something that's art related. Even in spaces that are supposed to be very progressive, they still center men. And on one hand, you could say that it seems to be impressive because he is supposed to be the oppressor, and yet it's a big deal that he's able to be open-minded about this and like advocate for people who are oppressed. Like he's able to kind of like open the door. But I would argue that people are also subconsciously gravitating towards this idea of a non-threatening male artist because so many of the works of art that we've seen by women, even if they are great writers, are still not seen as universally acclaimed in the same way that a person like Neil Gaiman could be seen as a literary icon. And so rather than leaning into women who are writing great stories or people of color who are writing great stories, they still fall back into the idea of this harmless, intelligent, older white man being able to write stories that can still be considered a classic and universal to men and women alike. And these men have just the right comfortable level of liberal politics in order for people to feel comfortable with them because they are secure in their masculinity. They believe that women should have rights. So I think the fact that both creative industries and society in general centers men is why we keep having male authors be hailed up as like a feminist genius or like a pioneer for LGBT rights or whatever, even though so many other groups have been saying the same thing and have actually been doing the work instead of just talking about it on Twitter. So I think as a result of that happening, where people and industries are looking for that type of archetype to fulfill this need, it makes it very easy for predators who know the rhetoric and know the therapy language to prey upon women and use this to their advantage. These are the theories that I'm kind of wrapping my mind around to make sense of this, but I feel like regardless of whether that's true, I think the conclusion should be that white men do not need to be your hero. You don't need a good guy to be your feminist activist, and you don't need an artist or a writer of a book you really like to be your role model or your hero either, especially if that person is a man. Why do you need a man to advocate for women's rights or LGBT rights or whatever rights he's not a part of? While it's true that you can gain traction with allies, why are we not putting more attention and support towards the people who are in those marginalized groups in the first place and actually doing the work? Something that a friend once told me that really resonated was when their ex-partner told them that he wasn't a misogynist. And my friend thought to themselves, that cannot be true because even I have internalized misogyny. So you, a man, telling me that you don't have misogyny, even though other women deal with that themselves, that is total BS. The other topic that I want to talk about is that it seems to me that every time an artist gets exposed for being a predator or have some kind of horrible behavior, people then will take a look at the work that this person has produced and then prescribe some kind of morality on it. Whether it's shock that this person could be horrible because their work seems to present such wholesomeness or seems to present values that are against what this artist actually has. Or on the flip side, another group of people might be like, well, I'm glad that I never got into this person in the first place because I could tell that this person was creepy or weird or whatever. Or they might look at the previous work and be like, actually, yeah, it was kind of weird that this person did this and this in their work. Either way, the artist's previous work gets dissected and analyzed to try to figure out were there hints about this artist's morality or lack of morality. And I saw some of those conversations when it came to Neil Gaiman because even though I haven't read his work, the people who were starting to criticize it more pointed out the fact that the stories and books that he wrote had men torturing and raping and murdering women, but this was supposed to be evidence of his empathy because it was still showing these men that were doing that to women as bad people. So he had the knowledge that this was bad. Therefore, he should have either been a good guy for being able able to distinguish that, or he's actually a bad guy because he was still co-opting that. I kind of veer back and forth because for context, I rarely read male authors because a lot of times when I read a book written by a man, I can really tell that a man has written it because of the way that they write female characters. So it doesn't surprise me when I see work by a male artist or a writer that show women being abused somehow, especially in the fantasy and sci-fi world. This is a very common thing that a lot of male writers tend to have, and even though they can distinguish in the narrative that this is wrong, it is still very distracting to me because I can still tell that this is through the lens of like a man. This is the male gaze being projected upon that. But I also don't want to make like a universal statement that male authors who write about women getting beaten up or whatever actually advocate for women getting beaten up, because that is just not really accurate or fair to people who write about difficult topics, whether they're a man or a woman. Just because you write about a horrible thing happening doesn't mean you actually like doing that horrible thing in real life. I read a criticism that most of the women in Neil Gaiman's books are side characters and just exist to support the male characters and their storylines. And so pointing out that pattern of him being regressive in the type of tropes and stereotypes that he's writing about women in the narrative could make it unsurprising that he turns out to be a piece of shit. But again, I don't know if that's a fair conclusion to make for all artists in general, because there are absolutely male writers who can be very shitty when it comes to writing women, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're predators. It just means that they operate within the patriarchy and are used to stories being told a certain way. I don't think it's fair to evaluate morality based on art. And the fact that people are so shocked when an author like Neil Gaiman or J.K. Rowling can have horrible politics or do very harmful actions towards people, and yet they write stories that seem to say differently. Wrestling with that kind of discrepancy means that you are putting certain morals on the piece of art that you are consuming and having that apply to the person who made it. I believe that good art doesn't make good people. And conversely, good people don't make good art either. I don't think there is a correlation because they are two different things. And I feel like conflating it to be the same thing is why the book community tends to get up in arms with arguing with each other when it comes to their different tastes in books, whether someone hates a book that you like or vice versa. The reason why a reader feels personally attacked by that is because they're projecting their morality or their goodness as a person onto this piece of work. And so a person who doesn't like it is a direct threat to whoever you perceive yourself to be. I also feel like this is connected to this internet phenomenon that people have where if they don't like a piece of media or they don't like a public figure, like an artist or a writer or whoever, instead of just simply accepting that they don't like this person or this piece of work, they have to prescribe some kind of moral reason. It's not that this person is annoying, it's that they're problematic in some way. It's not that this piece of media just isn't for me, it's that it is objectively bad for some kind of moral reason. I think that art is self-expression from people, and so therefore you are putting parts of yourself into the work that you're creating. But when we, the readers or the watchers, are consuming that work, we don't know which of those bits those artists are putting themselves into. We don't know the extent of how much their work is being reflected of their own personal selves or morality. And so I think making assumptions of creators based on the work that they're producing isn't going to be an accurate thing. I think Neil Gaiman is a rapist and a predator, but it was not because of how he wrote women in fiction. I don't think that is a way to predict that he was going to do those things. It was because he was enabled to do those things by his wife and society and the industry and other things going on in the real world.
Editing Cindy here. Basically what I'm trying to say is that you can believe that Neil Gaiman is a predator not because of the art that he's made, but because of the victims that come forward. That is where the proof of it should lie, not in the art that someone is making, but by their actions in the real world.
Anyway, the conclusion is I hope that we never cross paths in the author world. But if we do, even though I am physically weaker, he is still in his 60s. So I feel like I could still square up. If you made this far, thank you for watching, and sorry for such a heavy video topic today. My next video will be a lot more fun because it is going to be a book roast for a book that I had the displeasure of reading. So I will see you then. I hope you take care of yourself in the new year, and goodbye.